It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Linton Salmon. He has joined DARPA in September 2014, and among the programs that he has launched and is directing there and are of interest to this audience are CRAFT, circuit realization at faster timescale, and SITH, which is system security integrated through hardware and firmware. CRAFT is creating methodologies, design methodologies and tools that are meant to reduce the design time of an SoC by a factor of 10. And SITH is a program that's addressing security issues in a CPU, and it's explicitly targeting RISC-V cores, so that should be of interest to everyone here. And prior to joining DARPA, Dr. Salmon has worked for 15 years or so in different executive positions, conducting and directing research and development in CMOS processing at Global Foundries, TI, and AMD. And prior to that, he worked in academia. He was a professor at electrical engineering and physics at BYU, and he was also a vice president of research and technology transfer at Case Western. He also served as NSF Director of Solid State and Microstructured programs, and he was a member of the steering committee of the first ITRS. So that's the brief presentation. I don't want to take more time. So thank you. Welcome, Linton Salmon.
Thank you for the kind introduction. All right, let's see if I can actually figure this one out. That's the first. It says next and back. That ought to be a good indication. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I think if you look at the title, I try and be a little bit vague in the fact that if those of you that know the government know that it is a very broad set of organizations and there is not one perspective on any topic. It's kind of like we used to say in a faculty in a university. If you want to know the number of opinions there are in the faculty, you take the number of faculty members and multiply it times 2 because we can't make up our minds. It's a little bit similar in the government, but I will give you a perspective which I think is rather reflective of what many of the people feel inside of the government, and hopefully it's helpful as we have a discussion. But try and leave time at the end for some questions, because I think that the interaction may be very valuable as well. I am a program manager at DARPA in the Microsystems Technology Office, and I'm what they call a middle-aged program manager, in that I've been there 3 years, and we're all temps. In fact, the institutional memory at DARPA is in the contractors. And if that doesn't bend your brain, then you're not listening to me. So the first question is, why does the Department of Defense need custom integrated circuits? And there's a real debate within the government of, hey, let's just use commercial off the shelf. You know, we've got people that work very hard, brilliant teams that develop these fantastic chips, and we're not going to compete with the groups that do that. We don't have the necessary markets. I mean, it's a $300 billion market for silicon ICs these days. And this slide is an attempt to try and point out why that is so. So the first thing, and by the way, it is also called the Ain't ASICs Awesome slide. That's the one that we use internally. On this side is computational efficiency, and it's measured in giga operations per watt. It's not gigaflops, it's giga operations per watt. And that's because I want it to be able to be used for non-von Neumann computing when flops won't work. But it is a computational efficiency per power, because in almost all of the applications inside the DoD, power is a major constraint. The other is a technology node. So what you see here is you see a slope, and that is Moore's law, which we know and love. This is also a log scale, which is something everyone should see. It's a log linear. So the first thing to see is there's a nice slope here as we go in technology node. That's what we all hear about. It's one of the things that I had to do in industry was we constantly had a discussion with the designers. We were the process jocks, and they came up and we had a big, long 4 to 6 month conversation about how much technology pop we would give them for each node. You'll notice I said technology pop. I didn't talk about area because that had to reduce by 2. That was not a negotiable item. But the other thing I want to point out, and this is work I originally stole the concept from Horowitz, who presented it in a plenary talk at ISSCC, And what you see is general purpose CPUs, and these are Intel CPUs, are here. You can see they follow Moore's law very well. But if you look at this band up here, these are GPUs, which is the reason why GPUs are used in high-performance computing applications. But if you look at ASICs, you can see here there's a factor of 1,000 improvement in performance at power of an ASIC, a custom integrated circuit made for a specific reason, over using a standard CPU that you use software to program. I think anybody who thinks about this for longer than a few seconds realizes this is pretty obvious. The reason is this is made specifically to do a specific task. It only does that task. It doesn't do any of the other things. And as a result, it doesn't have to have power and overhead. I actually think it's part of the second law of thermodynamics that if you want additional flexibility, you will pay for it in power somehow. And in this particular case, it's a factor of on the order of 1,000. Of course, it depends on the application. We had an application that we looked at. It was a specific COM application. To write the software in a CPU was about 1,280 watts. To do it in an FPGA was around 120 watts. And in an ASIC, it was less than 4 watts. And those numbers are fairly typical. And the reason that we need that inside of the government is because we are increasingly needing to push a lot of computation out to the edge. And what I mean in that particular case is it's not a centralized facility we connect through the internet, but it's out at the edge where the actual action is happening, where the sensing is happening, where the communications is happening. Whatever it is that we're trying to do, more and more we'd like to push that computing out to the edge because then it is more real-time and it is more dependable. So I've got a particular application I show here. EW stands for electronic warfare. Today we have a particular approach. It's single channel, non-real-time. It takes about 240 watts. So that's what this yellow point is. If we took that same algorithm and we just said, well, we're going to put it at the edge in 100 watts, we're going to make it multiple channels, cover a wide range of the spectrum, and we're going to make it real time rather than getting the information 3 hours later, and I think all of you can figure why that would be a good thing. It puts us actually up in this region, which means we have to be building an ASIC, and it needs to be built in leading-edge CMOS technology. The real bottom line is, inside of DARPA, we're coming up with more creative and better ways to do things, and they almost always involve more computation. If there's one theorem, it is, if we're going to give you a capability, we'll require more power to do it, and that's a problem. So if we took a new cognitive EW approach, a new way we want to do things, and it was real-time and wideband and under 100 watts, it's actually off the curve up here. So the way I describe it is, oh, excuse me, I neglected that one. That's where we are today, unfortunately, using older technology. The first thing we need to do is doing ASICs in the leading edge technology, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, and what you actually are doing in the commercial arena as well. But I'm just going to put this out that there are other programs that say we want to get off of Moore's curve altogether. We want to go to new algorithms, new architectures that would be even more advanced. But as I said, what I'm going to be talking about today is our efforts to get in this region. So with that motivation, the statement could be, well, why are you any different than commercial guys? Right? Got the same constraints. They all want the same power efficiency. My cell phone has a similar kind of requirement. Well, the real problem is that the problems in the DoD aren't the same problems as they are in commercial. And the other big problem is our volumes are just minuscule. So what I wrote up here to try and be generic, I actually said low volume, read that as Department of Defense. High volume, read that as your cell phone or your PC. And these guys are somewhere in between, and if you find yourself there, that's fantastic. What I think the big one to look at is this volume. So this is 1,000 parts, this is a million parts, and this is 100 million parts. And these are data that I took. Now, this is all my data. It hasn't been sanctioned. This actually has some data behind it because I have the DoD data. I did send this to a couple of commercial guys in the high volume area and said, is this about right? And they said, we can't say. And I said, well, just tell me if it's wrong. And they said, we can't say. So I think this is pretty accurate. I found out people will tell you no really quickly. They won't tell you yes very quickly. And the big thing I would point out that you need to look at is the design NRE, that's non-recurring engineering costs. That's the cost to do things in this arena, which, remember, DoD, 92% of the expenditure is in design. By contrast, if you look over here, 9% of the expenditure is in design. Similarly, by the way, there's a production slice in there. That 1% doesn't even exist because 1,000 parts isn't production, okay? But I had to put something in there or the pie chart wouldn't give me the section, and then it would look weird. So I stuck in 1% just to make it work. As I tell people, I have yet to see a runner in DoD that was as big as the samples we sent out to customers for free from our foundries. So the point here is design is the whole problem. And that was interesting because as I talked to people when I first got to DARPA inside the government, their thought was, oh, it's so expensive to do the fab. In actuality, for the DoD, that is not the problem. And we have small enough volumes we can use multi-project wafers, and those costs get amortized across multiple projects. And that's just not the problem. These guys, it's the problem because you have to buy full mass sets. The production costs are a major portion of the expense. So when you put this together, it says, well, the DoD ought to be doing something about reducing design costs. And that actually is what CRAFT was originally intended to do. And if you look at ID and POSH, which are two programs that are in selection right now, that's what we're about. And I might say that the trends are bad. These are numbers that we pulled out of the literature, and you can see that the cost to actually build, the number of transistors is going up dramatically, the complexity is going up dramatically, and the costs are going up dramatically. This is all in the wrong direction because remember, our design costs are 92% of the costs for any DoD, custom integrated circuit project. So when I was in industry, even at those $100 million costs, we were using IP from everywhere. We were buying it third party, we were building it internally and reusing it multiple times. IP reuse was what it was all, it was so much what it was all about that nobody even talked about it. It was just what we did, and we've been doing for quite a while. This happens to be an example of a Snapdragon from Qualcomm because they happen to put it in the open literature. And you can see there's a bunch of different IP inside of here, and in reality there are far more than you see here, as opposed to if you recognize either just the major ones they would confess to. This is just another statement that the complexity is going up quite dramatically, and that's why the costs are going up. So the real question is open source IP the answer? And my first slide is, there's some good news. The guy's there with his thumb up. Open source IP can sharply reduce the resources, time, and complexity that are required for a DoD design. I said that the cost is mostly design NRE, and if you can drop that dramatically, that's a great deal. The other thing is the time scales. I gotta confess, there were a bunch of shocks when I came into the government. I've been working in industry for actually more than 15 years. The way I described it was my interaction with the federal government was paying taxes and voting. That's what I knew about for that time. I mean, I was in the commercial enterprises. We were just charging for our commercial, activities. And when I got inside, I looked at the timescales and was blown away. And part of that reason is because the DoD people are not able to leverage this wide, IP arena that commercial guys use. And the problem with that is that we don't have 100 designs and millions of parts that we can amortize that third-party IP cost across. So the commercial mechanism just doesn't work for the DoD. But open source would help us do that. We can also use it to design unique DoD applications. In other words, you can build the building blocks. The reason that using custom off-the-shelf or commercial off-the-shelf parts doesn't work so well is because our applications are unique. They look and feel similar. There's a lot of applications that look and feel kind of like a cell phone, but they're not a cell phone. And by the way, they're not a cell phone that it isn't used like a cell phone, it isn't used in places like a cell phone. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, the consequences of dropping a call are very, very different than your cell phone. Although some of us, if we forget to pick up the milk on our way home, may not seem all that different. The other thing is that we can get detailed information about open source IP, and that can enable greater trust. And I will separate trust from security. Trust means I believe that it will do what it was supposed to do and only what it was supposed to do. That's what I define as trust. Security is nobody can come in and do bad things to me. Those are two very different faces. They result in the same problem, which is quality, but the detailed information that's available, we could dig into it to our heart's content. We can do as much due diligence as we want to do. For very good reasons, commercial IP is not willing to do that. I mean, the IP itself is the crown jewels. That's where they make their money. Like the rest of you, I'm addicted to eating. So are they. So we need to make money. And at the end of the day, that makes it harder. Open source IP does not have that problem. The other thing is it allows us to go in and modify IP to increase security. I'll talk a little bit about the SIF program a little later, but the way I describe it jokingly is we have a securometer, right? And in most applications for the Department of Defense, we want the securometer turned all the way, clockwise. In commercial arena, it won't be, right? I mean, in the commercial arena, I must admit, if you told me I could have a cell phone that lasted 30 minutes, that's all it would last, but it would be completely secure, I'd say, thank you very much, please take the thing back. In the Defense Department, that won't be what we'll say. We'll just say, well, the poor joker has to schlep 20 batteries. I mean, at some point, that's better than having an insecure activity. So we have a different requirement, and having open source IP enables us to go make those changes. So I'm going to, then the other thing is, not all the news is good. You saw the guy with the thumb up, he was ready to go. This engine clearly isn't ready to go. I will also point out that this engine is being repaired, not thrown on the trash heap, so it's not like we can't do it, it's just there are some problems. That's why I said not so good news rather than bad news. The open source community really needs to develop a complete infrastructure. And this is something that is very hard to do, but is essential for DoD uptake. These programs need to happen. People they are not tolerant of a lot of risk. And by risk, what I mean is they're not tolerant of a lot of schedule creep or additional costs. The way the whole structure is built up, those things need to be well understood at the start. And in many cases, a contractor will decide, I will go to something that's lower risk, even though it's lower performance, because then I can count on it. There are tremendous penalties if I don't meet my requirements. So the infrastructure really needs to be there, and that's difficult to do in an open source environment. Open source IP needs to be more robust than it is right now. And by robust, what I mean is it needs to be fully verified, it needs to have full verification engines, people need to be able to incorporate it and be confident of two things. Number one, that they can incorporate it, that they have all the necessary tools, and number two, that once they incorporate it, it works. And the third thing is, this infrastructure isn't free. And I don't mean free as in you got to pay for it, I mean free as in people take effort and time to build it. And that has to be compensated in some way. And as I've commented before, I'm addicted to eating. I think most of you are as well. And that means I need to take home a paycheck of some sort. And people need to do that. And there needs to be a compensation. It doesn't necessarily have to be money, but there needs to be a way for money to be made in the entire enterprise for it to be funded. And then the last thing is there needs to be long-term support. Time frames in the Department of Defense are very different than time frames commercially. I mean, the classic one we all pick is how long B-52 bombers have been flying, longer than I've been alive. And they keep upgrading them. Now, that is clearly something on the edge of the bell curve, but I will tell you that systems sit out there regularly for 15 to 20 years, and that is almost inconceivable from a commercial time frame. I mean, that's just like forever. Companies rise, die, go away, get resurrected, die, and that kind of time. And all of that's necessary for the DoD to use it. So what I will try and do is go through each of these with a little more detail, both of the good news and the not so good news. So, unique differentiation. The real important thing about it is most of these applications that we do inside the DoD are not 100% unique. In fact, you can have an argument, over dinner or something, you can have an argument whether it's 70% or 80% or 90% reuse and 30, 20, or 10% unique, but it's certainly no more than 30% unique. A standard SOC that we build for a system most of it is not unique. And as a result, any money that we spend collectively doing this stuff that everybody else does is really wasted. What we'd love to do is go buy that off, out of in the community, or bring it in somehow, and then concentrate and spend our money on the secret sauce. Once again, this is what commercial guys do as well. The difference for commercial guys is the design piece isn't as big of the total cost, And the second thing is, in general, they have more differentiation in their application than we do. Open source can address both the costs and availability of that IP. And IP macros are the first step. And this is something else that was unique that I didn't realize when I came to DARPA. As I started talking to people about how they were designing ICs and chips, one of the things that I found is I thought, oh, well, we'll get this core in and then everything will be good. No, no, no. You need the core, you need all the busing, and then you need all the infrastructure and tools that enable you to do that. In other words, it's the whole enchilada. It's not just the third-party hard IP. It's the entire integration activity that's necessary as well. One of the important things, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is most of the design teams in the DoD are small. And they're small for very good reasons. That the design team doesn't make 20 chips a year or 5 chips a year. They do 1 chip every 5 years. And as a result, they can't maintain large teams that sit around and twiddle their thumbs for 90% of their time. So we need to be able to do this with small teams, and that means that their activities, A, have to be facilitated, and B, I think it was Chris was talking about, you keep doing these designs again and again and again, and you start getting good at it. Well, if you don't do them again and again and again, then there needs to be another mechanism so that you can do them successfully. And in my experience, that's what gets embedded in tool chains, is experience that other people have that they embed in the tool chain that then is used by a less experienced group. Widely accepted standards are required for continued development, but that's really possible with third-party IP. And so far, I've tried to be generic. I'll get to a slide specifically on RISC-V, but I think you can all see the application points. But standards are very important, A, because that enables everything to plug and play, and B, because they have a long lifetime. Okay, open source enables specialization. I think I've already said most of this. I tried to pick here commercial systems from server farms to your cell phone to, I'm sorry, I can't show, things that I don't have a copyright for, so it had to come out of Wikimedia. I don't know that this is the best one. I'd rather have something that's even smaller, but that's an echo. And if you look at it, you can kind of find there are corresponding kinds of system sizes that exist in the DoD. And design teams, single design team may do something that goes into something that's very big, something that's pretty moderate, and something that's very, very small. And if you use open source IP, you can actually do that. You can make it unique for the particular area that you have. However, the important thing to realize is that unique implementations are critical, and specialization is required for success. In other words, the value of the system is not based on what percentage of it is unique. In fact, you could have even 2 or 3% of a system or an SoC being unique and still have it immensely valuable. And that is the power of the first curve I showed you, which is if you go to specialization, you get much better power performance. Trust, and I think this is a place I'll try and go into. Excuse the effort at trying to show an integrated circuit put over a stamp. Clearly, we don't use magnifying glasses, unless we're still doing Ruby liths someplace in the room. But at any rate, that was an effort to try and say, it's a real concern inside of the government, and I think you can understand why. Counterfeiting, cloning are all well-known, ubiquitous events that happen. They happen in the defense world. They also happen in the commercial world. So the opportunity, and if any of you have read Ghost Fleet, that book, if you have, it'll probably keep you awake at night for a little while. It did me. There are real problems if people can insert things that you don't know are there, or a kill switch, or some malware, or something like that. It's a real problem. And commercial guys, the way I used to describe it is that when I was working at TI, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars making sure that our chips did what they were supposed to do. We didn't spend a single cent on making sure it didn't do something, that it didn't do something it wasn't supposed to do. That was not our problem. Our problem was making sure it did what it was supposed to do. So the commercial guys have a very different set of motivations than we do. And I might say, we also said, hey, as long as we make it commercially non-viable, nobody will do it. I mean, cloning one of our chips, we used to say, forget it. By the time they clone it, we've moved on 2 generations. Good luck with that. They'd be better off just starting from scratch and trying to compete than trying to be behind us all the time. That doesn't apply in the case of governments, because they're not necessarily commercial decisions that are going to be made. And open source IP has a valuable opportunity because we can look at everything. Down to the gate level, we can look at the transistor level, we can look at the GDS, we can look at the RTL, we can look at all the verification suites, we can, if we're good enough, we can find the tools that are necessary to make sure it only does what it's supposed to do. We can actually make sure that there's equivalency all through the process. And that's not possible in general with commercial IP. And we can develop tools so that we can look at all of that. Because it's open source, because there's standards, we can develop tools that allow us to go and do that inspection more easily. In effect, the DoD, even though we only design a small piece of it, we can own the entire die, which puts us into a position to make sure that we have trust. In addition, this is something that's dear to my heart. We have an opportunity also to put in special hooks for security. The SITH program that Silvio talked about, system security integrated through hardware and firmware, one of its premises is that the hardware needs to stop being gullible. The way I describe it is the software comes in and says, please do this, and the hardware says, oh sure, I'll do it as fast and as low power as I can. Just please give it to me. I want to do it, I want to do it, I want to do it. And if it's a bad idea, they do it very, very quickly. If it's a good idea, they do it very, very quickly. But in a large degree, in fact, I have a joke. I think, and maybe if there's Intel people, they can tell me if this is true, that Intel and Microsoft got together in the 70s, and somebody in the room said, well, what about security? And the Microsoft guy said, you don't have enough transistors, you don't have enough performance, you're too high a power, we'll take care of it. And the Intel guys were bright enough that they were out the door before the sentence was finished. And I don't think we can afford that anymore. I think the hardware has to be part of the solution, cannot afford to be gullible. Well, that's all fine and good, but remember I talked about the securometer. It means inside the government that we need to be able to ratchet it all the way over to a place that does not make sense commercially. I'm not trying to say people are short-sighted. I'm saying it does not make sense commercially. It makes sense for us, not commercially. So as a result, using third-party IP allows us to go in and modify that IP, modify the architecture, so that we can make it more secure, and we can do that without trying to convince a large corporation to completely move their entire product line to a place that doesn't make sense commercially so they can meet our little DoD needs. We're in a position to make that decision ourselves. And I think that is a basis, as I talk about a little bit later with SITH. So, DARPA interest in RISC-V. RISC-V is very adaptable. We talk a lot about we're going to build this SoC and we need a C engine. It's just something that runs C. I mean, we're not going to do most of the computation inside the CPU because, as I just pointed out, that's too power intensive. So we're going to do a lot of the computation, we're going to do a lot of the unique stuff off of the CPU, but you've got to program it some way. I don't know how many DoD programs that had great technical solutions, but because they couldn't do the software, it died. In fact, I really think we should swap the names between software and hardware because it's a lot harder to change software than it is to change hardware. But at any rate, that's just my own opinion. RISC-V is an open standard. That makes the transition to DoD very easy. Because it's an open standard, because there's been a tremendous amount of work by people in this room to make sure that there is a core open standard. If we go put something that's unique on it, it may be unique to us, just like a corporation may have something that's unique to them, but the base is a set of standards that are extremely important. And I'm very gratified at the work that's being done by many of the people in this room to make sure that those standards stay intact and stay viable. And we can build them, as I said before, in a way that's trusted, and we can actually increase security in them as well. So I think RISC-V, as I look at it, really provides us an excellent opportunity. It's a needed component. If we can meet some of those, the not so good news, I think we will be in a place where it can be very successful. That's why I'm here, and that's why some of my colleagues are involved. We can maybe talk a little bit more about how we do get involved and how we don't get involved later on. Probably not appropriate for this wide audience directly in a talk, but we're very interested in it because of its power. So the not so good news. That says wonderful. Your answer would be, how come there's not a gazillion-dollar program to do RISC-V, make it work for everything inside of the DoD? You know, there aren't everybody knocking down your door saying we've got all these programs. There's got to be some not so good news. So here it is. We've already discussed it a little bit. Let me go through each one. Now, at the risk of showing something from ARM at the RISC-V workshop, sorry about that, the first thing I'd note is this is from an APM, a ARM partners meeting. Those guys are wearing suits. Okay? Do I need to say anything more? Really, there are a lot of commercial people there with a lot of commercial products behind it. Remember I talked about funding? ARM is doing just fine, thank you. They're making plenty of money. Those people are eating well. And it's because there's a group of commercial people who wanted the ecosystem. The net result is they've built out a huge ecosystem. And I might say if RISC-V were before ARM took off, people might have been more willing to kind of go along and do some of the design themselves. This is crack cocaine, right? I mean, they're used to somebody gives it to them. You know, they're a relatively inexperienced design team. They can walk in and build a cell phone. We all know that that's happened. And it's because the infrastructure all exists and people get used to it. So this is the competition. This is just showing, I mean, you don't need to read each one of those. I'm sure you all read them, but it's far more than an IP core. It's a lot more than an IP core. I would say that the common infrastructure could be a great strength of RISC-V, but you need that common infrastructure. And it's always got to work. And I say that and I pretend, does the ARM infrastructure always work? No. Does any infrastructure always work? No. So please don't make me think that go away with that my opinion is it's got to be perfect. It needs to meet a level of perfection that is acceptable to people, and they have to do a minimal amount of fiddling with it. But I really think it's the whole ecosystem. And it's easy for us in a room to think about a small slice of it, whether it's my thinking about security, or someone else is thinking about verification, or someone else thinking about performance, or someone else thinking about software. It's easy to think that it's only our slice. And unfortunately, it has to be the whole enchilada for this to be successful. Second thing is, now this is the Challenger taking off. It's not a DoD application. The implications of failure are a little bit different, right? That's one of the stories I tell. When my cell phone doesn't work, in fact, I would argue we had failure rates in our chips that were relatively high. They would not be acceptable for servers because they were so much lower than the software failure rates, right? I mean, your phone doesn't lock up for the hardware, it locks up for the software. And as long as we were well below the software failure rates, we're good. As I said, the consequences of your cell phone dropping a call or taking an extra 2 seconds to load a whatever, or doing, your laptop having the control alternate delete, the results of that, while painful, are nothing like life-threatening. Whereas simply in defense applications, quite often they are. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is it's hard to make things robust. They don't just fall out that way. And in fact, a lot of the work's being done in universities, and no, this is absolutely no negative pan on universities. But you don't get PhDs for taking, a design and making it more robust for commercial application. And universities are intended to educate students and do great research. They're not intended to make commercial things commercially robust. So I let universities off the hook on this one. I mean, manifestly make them off the hook, but that means somebody needs to do it. And once again, people who need to eat. And it needs to be validated all the way through silicon implementation and test. Just go talk, if you are a commercial guy, just think about the two as the same. And that's what we need, at least. And we need the savings. We need to be able to depend on open source IP, and I might say one of the differentiations we need inside of the DoD is we will drive it across different corners. We have different operating conditions. So it's different. Once again, this is a not so good. It doesn't mean it's a challenge. It doesn't mean it's unsurmountable in any way. This was an effort. This was my image that I could pull out the money by the pound. Successful open source infrastructure requires a lot of work. In the case of ARM, they get their payment direct from people that pay royalties all the time. The beauty of an open source is that it doesn't require that kind of thing, so it can be open, it can be much more valuable. But the challenge is because you don't have that unique commercial payment, you need to find a way to fund it. Not just fund it in the beginning, but also fund it in the long term. I might just say, kind of prefetching the questions and answers, please don't ask me why doesn't DARPA do that. That's not what DARPA does. We don't do infrastructure. That is manifestly not our responsibility, not because we're wimps and don't want to take on hard problems, but because with our budget, if we took on infrastructure, no new research would have gotten done. We would have been stuck on some infrastructure problem 30 years ago and never moved off of it. So we have an institutional bias, which is we build up, show feasibility, and then the infrastructure needs to be done somewhere else. We are not only willing, but anxious to help that infrastructure go through and get going. So it's not like we're uninterested parties by any stretch of the imagination. But if you think the solution is to have a RISC-V program that lasts for 30 years and make sure all this infrastructure goes, that isn't what we do. We can discuss about who does and how it would be done. I'd love that conversation, but just to prefetch. The work's tough. It's a grind. I know. I did it for a number of years. And it's a grind. It can be very satisfying, but once again, it's not the source of PhD dissertations. The other thing, which I think this group does very well, and I've seen it, is you need to continue with improvements over time. One of the things we think about is, well, we'll just put in place infrastructure, get it on life support and we're done. And that just doesn't work. It has to continue to evolve. I actually think that's a strength of this community. It's a strength of open source. It's something we need to make sure continues. And the reason I say that is the standard can't stay fixed either. How many of you ever designed with a PDK that continually shifted underneath you? Yeah, right. The people who are moaning. Being the group that provided that PDK, I feel your pain. But we can't have the standard shifting all the time, but it needs to improve in such a way that people can continue to use it. And once again, the DoD timescales are 10 to 25 years, not 2 to 5 years. So I'm going to switch gears just real quickly to finish up and talk about the programs that are driving open source IP, including RISC-V. The first one is the PERFECT program. It's actually ending and ramping down, but between PERFECT and StarNet, that is the DARPA contribution to RISC-V and its beginnings. There have been a lot of industrial, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. So we're not going to claim we built the internet here like our colleague did, even though we did build the internet. But anyway, so PERFECT started. My program, which is about halfway through at this point, is called CRAFT, Circuit Realization at Faster Timescales. It is all about reducing the amount of time it takes to do a DoD SoC by a factor of 10x. And open source IP, and specifically RISC-V, is an important part of that. It's not an explicitly important part, but it is an important part of that. As you saw earlier, it's a very reasonable core to use, and it is getting some of its maturity through that program. SITH is a program, SITH is a program that will just be kicking off, we hope, in 2 weeks. So it hasn't actually started yet. But the whole idea is to have design methodologies that are available to do security in the hardware. And then 2 new programs, POSH and IDEA, are being run by Andreas Olofsson, who is a relatively new program manager, came out of industry, had a startup where he was doing design of massively multi-core projects. And Andreas has 2 that are called POSH and IDEA, and right now they're in the selection process, which means I can't talk about them much. So this is just a slide on CRAFT. So the first part is design, reducing it by a factor of 10x. Remember I said about 25-year timescales and how that just kind of goes out of focus for me when I think about it from a commercial perspective. And what that means is we can't sit in a fab and expect it to be the same fab manned by the same people for 25 years. That just doesn't happen in commercial. I mean, I was in a company for 9 years, and in those 9 years, we had massive upheavals at least 3 times. So it's hard for me to see that we can do this by sitting in one fab. So we have to be in a position where we can port. Porting to me means moving in one technology node from one fab to another and one company to another. So going from 16 FFC and TSMC to 14 LPP at Samsung or at GlobalFoundries. And migrate means that you go from 16 or 14 nanometer to 7 nanometer, for example. We need to be in a position where we can do that, and it actually turns out that a lot of the mechanisms that we use to reduce that design time by a factor of 10x also apply to being able to port. To a large extent, it's all about reuse again, but it's reuse at a different level than third-party IP. And then a repository is something that we have inside of the government where if we have these open source inspected stuff, we have a place to put it so they can be pulled out. So that's that program. As I said, it's about halfway through. It's got about another 18 months to go. SITH, and I will not go through this slide in detail because that will take the remaining 9 minutes. Suffice it to say, we're trying to protect the problem here. The way we do it now is you protect at the software level. And there's a million different ways the software can be compromised. In this case, it isn't a million. It's 2,800 instances that are inside of what's the NIST MITRE CVE, which is the Common Vulnerability Exposures Index. 2,800 of those in 2015 were due to what I called hardware weaknesses. They were all software, and all the patches were software patches to fix this software and that software. I believe that if you'd fixed 7 vulnerabilities inside the hardware, you would have addressed all 2,800 of those, as well as the 3,600 that happened in 2016 and the 500,000 that'll happen in 2017. Fix it at the hardware, make sure the hardware isn't so gullible. I repeat, this does not fix all of the security vulnerabilities by any stretch of the imagination, but we estimate it covers around 40%, which is a pretty good number. So that's what the program is about. It's to build hardware design tools and IP to provide inherent security against hardware vulnerabilities that are exploited through software. So this is software doing row hammer, stack buffer overflow, cyber key exchange, those kinds of security weaknesses in hardware to be repaired. And open source, the intention is that the IP, the security IP and the design tools will be open source. So they'll be used across the DoD and commercially. For this to be successful, for this to be wildly successful, it has to go into, all the commercial hardware you know about. And it's done in such a way that we can use that COTS hardware and actually turn the secure-meter up. IDEA and POSH. IDEA is a no human in the loop 24-hour layout generation. It's to take care of that back-end design problem. To do that, Andreas has some really great ideas on how that can actually occur. There's no such thing as a free lunch, so it may not have the same packing density, it may not have the same performance, but it'll be close enough, and it will be far easier. And then POSH is open source hardware. It's right in the name. And this is an opportunity to develop an ecosystem generally, and I can't believe that RISC-V won't be a critical part of that. And unless I'm mistaken, I'm finished, and I have about 6 minutes for questions. Thank you.
We got a couple of mics on this side, and over here, Allison's got one. Just state your name and affiliation and ask your question, please.
Dave Patterson, UC Berkeley. It seemed like a lot of your concerns about the economic models for open source hardware don't really apply to open source software. There seem to be many ways that that we've found ways for people to gain recognition or other ways to make open source software. So do you think that's fundamentally different, or can the same things happen that happen with software for hardware?
So everybody heard that because he was on the microphone. I think that's an excellent question. I think it's why we have such high hopes for hardware. I will say, as an old commercial guy in hardware, the very first time you bring this up, I go, can't possibly work. Fortunately, I'm wise enough to know that my initial responses are not always correct. We can have an argument whether they're never correct, but certainly a lot of times they aren't. It has worked in software, and it has worked marvelously in software. And so that's why we have some high hopes in hardware. There are some differentiating things. One of the big ones is, if I download some open source software and run it, and I can pretty quickly find out whether it's going to work, it's robust, I don't like it, and I can reject it if I don't. And right now, we don't have that same mechanism in hardware. However, I think the fundamentals of the benefits of doing a wide group that works on it and the benefits accruing to all absolutely applies. I can't see any reason why it wouldn't. That's why I emphasize how do people get enough recognition. And you're right, too. It isn't just money. In fact, money probably, if we resort to money sloshing around in the system, it probably won't work. And there's lots of other things besides just money.
Yeah, I think, from students getting involved, I think it's recognition. The people establish their reputation via contributions to open source and become employable.
Yeah.
So I think, because I think the money thing is going to be, DARPA's not going to do it. I don't see how there's going to be a fund for it or something like that. So I think we need to think some other way.
Yeah, and I really agree. I think when I listed that, I listed it as a challenge. I think it is a challenge, but I'm very hopeful that it will occur. From a DoD perspective, we really want it to. One of the things that I realized as I came into the government was that there was a lot of people in the government kind of believe that we can afford to buy it all, that we can afford to drive it all, and we just can't. It's just not appropriate. I mean, the way I usually try and show that is I show the $300 billion bar, and then there's this little teeny red bar that is what we pay. And so I think we're very interested. My major concern is, do we get commercial concerns? Great to hear about Western Digital. Great to hear about involvement of other companies. To the extent they do, and I would love to work with them to make sure that there's enough funding, everybody accrues the benefit, and then it becomes very well worth it. So great point. Yes?
Hi, Robert O'Neill from Western Digital. Imagine that.
And I was going to say, thank you, sir.
It seems to me that some of your goals, some of the government's goals of security and robustness are starting or beginning to merge with the goals of the industry, in particular surrounding autonomous vehicles or IoT interest in autonomous process control, things of that nature, where any failure of either security or functionality, loses lives.
Yep.
And so are you able to take advantage of that merging of goals? And if so, why are you starting, or why aren't you?
So yes, we're trying to take advantage of it. So the way I would describe that is that's a work in progress. Specifically when I came in, we have a bunch of agreements. Most of my contracts, either for craft or for SITH, will not be with traditional performers. They'll be with non-traditional performers, people who come up and say that their interaction with the federal government is paying taxes and voting. And we, fortunately, in DARPA have what's called an other transaction authority that allows us to not do the strict FARS-based accounting, and that most commercial companies say we won't do that. It'll cost us far more to set that up than we'll get in benefit. So we do it under things that look much more like commercial terms, specifically because we want to engage. So I would say it's absolutely starting. I don't think we have come anywhere near where we need to be to leverage both sides. And I think it lies with both sides. We, inside of DARPA and the government, don't know the best ways to work with industry in the appropriate ways, and neither does industry know the best ways to work with us. That is a big focus for our entire office and for me personally. And I would welcome anybody who can come up and say, well, I tried it with DARPA and I had this, that, or the other problem, or we really like to do this kind of thing. We're interested in creative ways to work together. At the end of the day, it has to benefit the Department of Defense, security of the United States in some way, because we're paid by the taxpayer. We're not going to do commercial enterprises. And we also know that similarly on the industry side, it has to meet your commercial needs. But I can't but believe that there are many, many cases where both of those can be met, and where the technical opportunity exists and the business opportunity exists. We at DARPA are willing to work the contract and that kind of stuff to try and make sure it would exist. So very, very interested. It's a focus for me, and it's a focus for the office. But we're just at the beginning.
Okay, we have time for one more, Linton.
Okay. Oh, there, okay.
Edmund Hummenberger, you spoke about ASICs, but isn't FPGA an intermediate goal for those IP designers who cannot afford 100,000 for a cheap tape out?
Good question. I have been accused of being an ASIC bigot, and I'm not. I like FPGAs a lot, and I understand why they're so important. They have some tremendous advantages. They have very fast turnaround comparatively. However, in our applications where we've done the comparison like we did with GPUs and CPUs, we lose a factor of somewhere between 50 and 100 to 200x higher power for the same performance. And that's a real problem in many of our applications. The way I describe it is we have a power envelope. I know it seems like in the back of a jet fighter, I mean, we're throwing ergs out the back end like there's nobody business. How can you worry about a few watts? I mean, really? Believe it or not, they do worry. And they have budgets for what they actually can use in power inside of the avionics. And they certainly do on some poor special forces guy that's schlepping his batteries on his back. At the end of the day, that power envelope is fixed. It's fixed by the mission. And then they come back and say, oh, okay, well, what can we do for the warfighter based on that power envelope? And when that power envelope is the restricting force, I want an ASIC to be the solution rather than an FPGA, but it's only for that power requirement. There is another problem. Remember I said there were 10 to 25-year lifetimes? If you build a fixed ASIC, it's, and you continually have to spin it, there may be 50 different spins inside that 10 to 25 years. And so I think an FPGA has a tremendous benefit in that it's reprogrammable in the field. So the way I approach that actually is we've negotiated with a company that gives us the licensing rights inside the government for an embedded FPGA. And in fact, I would argue that almost all of our reasonable size SoCs will have embedded FPGAs going forward because we need to have portions of it that can be updated. But I believe strongly, and most of the stuff that we do on Craft is applicable to FPGAs as well. But yeah, they're great, just high power.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lyndon. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
You can see Lyndon got questions at lunch.